It's my pleasure to be the MC for this talk on behalf of SoA+D Architecture Program, King Mongkut University of Technology, Thonburi. Today, I am here with Ajahn Graeme Bristol, the Executive Director of the Center for Architecture and Human Rights, in the theme of Lesson Learned, SoA+D, and Time Well Spent. So now, allow me to introduce Assistant Professor Dr. Martin Scouch, our professor at SoA+D and the Assistant Dean for Internalization, for the opening of our talk today.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm happy to introduce Graeme Bristol here today. And Graeme Bristol was a professor here at SoA+D from 1998 to 2010, which is for quite some time. A lot of things have changed during that time. And I remember through conversations with Graeme that he mentioned that he actually was one of the first ones who started to bring students into communities and learn about community work. And I think this kind of feature exists still until today, that our school is known to be a place where community work and looking at communities, working together with communities is still something that we are doing. Graeme Bristol is Canadian. He started to work as an architect in Canada, but he also soon moved to Papua New Guinea. And I actually don't know the years when that was, but that was before SoA+D. And he was working there, also in with the Department of Works over there to develop the country. And after that, he actually came to Thailand. And I also know the funny story that they actually didn't plan to come to Thailand. It was more of a vacation thing. And he just happened to read the news in Bangkok Post on the day that he arrived. And he decided, and in the Bangkok Post, there was the advertisement for an open position here at our school. So he decided to give it a shot. And that's how he came to Thailand and came to SoA+D to teach the students here. I'm pretty sure many alumni are very aware of him and know him quite well. And I hope that our current students are also enjoying his talk. Ajahn Graeme always has been paying attention to how architecture and communities can work together, and especially how communities that are maybe not so not living the dream, but actually are communities in need, can benefit by working and collaborating together. And I'm hoping, and I'm sure we are going to have a very nice lecture about his work that he's been doing and how he cares about these weak communities that exist not only here in Thailand but in many places. Thank you. So I'd like to invite Graeme to give his talk.
What? Okay. Good morning, and thank you for organizing this. I greatly appreciate it. This is, I would say, a kind of a thank you note to SoA+D because I've learned a lot at this place over the years, and really that's what I want to talk about now. Just as a quick aside, this photograph was taken by one of my students when we were working in the construction camps in Samut Prakan. And I've used this particular photograph often because it reminds me of the work that needs to be done. So just so you have a clearer idea of who I am, I started at the University of Western Ontario and did a degree in English and philosophy. That was both good and bad in terms of my forthcoming career, you might say. After that, I started in architecture in 1974 and finally graduated in 1980. So I'm nearing 50 years ago, I started architecture school. I became registered as an architect in 1984, and then I went back to UBC to do a master's degree in architecture, a research degree that is, in 1987 to 1992. After that, I went to both work on my own small firm, and at the same time, I was a community organizer for the Downtown Granville Tenants Association in Vancouver. In the midst of all of that, I finally left in 1994 for Papua New Guinea to work for their Department of Works. And in 1997, I came to Bangkok, and as Martin pointed out, fortuitously read the newspaper, and that changed everything. So my first suggestion to students is always read the newspaper if you're visiting anywhere. It could change your life. You just don't know. I was here between 98 and 2010 and left then because I had to return to Canada after my mother had had a heart attack, and I was taking care of her until last year. And then in 2006, largely as a result of the work I was doing with students, I formed the Center for Architecture and Human Rights, and that's a Canada-based NGO. In 2008, I went back to school. At that point, I was probably the oldest student in the school at that stage. In fact, I was older than most of my professors, which was a little unusual. And in fact, I think most of my fellow students were looking at me with some suspicion, like, why is he here? He's too old for this. But I got an LLM, which is a master's degree in human rights law at the Queen's University, Belfast, in Ireland. Oops. So one of the issues that has occupied some of my time more recently is the passage of time. Now, Shakespeare often, well, at least he did once, talk about the 7 stages of man. I don't know if you've read this, but it's quite a funny interpretation of the stages of life. I kind of prefer Aristotle's interpretation of the stages of life in 3 parts. The first being what I call self-building, the creation of a self. Who am I and what am I doing here? The second stage is what Aristotle referred to as the political life. And the political life is the engagement with the world. And there we spend most of our time, I would say. The third stage, the stage I'm at right now, is the contemplative stage. And what that means is you tend to be more reflective. You're looking back on what you have done and what it meant. And that's part of the reason for this little talk today. The other point that comes to mind was from John Lennon, and that is that life is what happens while you're busy making other plans. And I think that always stuck with me because we're always making plans and those plans are always going awry, and yet somehow here we are. Are there any threads that pull these things together? And in that reflective stage of life, you start to pull those threads together and say, well, I think there is a connection between what I was doing when I was 21 and what I'm doing now. How did I get here at this particular place at this particular time? And the other approach that one can take to that is a more narrative kind of approach, the 3-act play, where I'm in the 3rd act for sure. Now, I read a book recently called 4,000 Weeks, and I questioned immediately, what is 4,000 weeks? So I got my calculator out, and it turns out that 4,000 weeks is just shy of 77 years. And I thought, ooh, well, that's a deadline. Is this the expected length of time I'm going to be living on this planet? Well, I did a second check, and the second check was in British Columbia, which is where I live now. What is the average age lifespan for a male living in British Columbia? And at that time, it was 79.55 years. Well, that's a little better than 4,000 weeks. So I get an extra 136 here. But still, if I take 4,000 weeks as a deadline, I'm already 97% finished. Because right now, I'm at something like 3890 weeks. That's a lot of weeks. And I divide that into 4,000, it's pretty close. If I take it as 4136 weeks, I'm already 94% done. Either way, it's over 90%. I've got 10% left. Now what? Now what am I going to do? There are plans afoot, but there's little time in which to do them, which means there's that period of reflection, but there's also a period of some resolution, I would say. Last June, I went to the 100th anniversary of my high school. And what that meant is it wasn't just a class reunion, it was a reunion of anybody who's still alive that ever went to that school, which is a little different. And the reason I was interested in actually going through that, because who am I going to know there? Probably nobody. And if I did know them, I probably wouldn't even recognize them. So many years have passed. But the reason I went is because I wanted to do what was called Career Day, where I stand up in front of a group of high school kids who are about to graduate and tell them about my career and what that meant. How did I get from sitting in that seat in high school to where I am today? Well, that created an interesting period of reflection in itself, because I had to ask the question, did I actually have a career? And honestly, I don't think I did. While a lot of my life was spent in architecture, and still is for that matter, happily so, I don't think I felt like I ever had a career at all, as one might have defined it in my father's time. So the question then was, if I'm giving this talk on Career Day, do I even know what a career is? My son, I felt, has a career. He's a doctor, and that's very focused. I was never as focused as he is, and architecture lends itself to that kind of broad focus, if you will. That we are thinking about a whole range of things from sociology to physics, and we enjoy that kind of dilettantish approach to life. So I never saw this as a career. I saw it more as an exploration, and so my interests were more in who these other explorers were and are. Um, Another part to that is if you're exploring, I think you're going to the edge of things. And I do believe still that if you go to the edge of things, you're going to learn a lot more than if you stay in the middle of things. If you take it to the edge, you're pressured into a greater level of action based on whatever it is you've got in your head at that time. And I find that very interesting in terms of learning. This is just an example of that. When I was, this was 1969, I got on a Honda 50, if you know what they are, the smallest Honda you could get, and I decided to take a trip to the Darien Gap. Why the Darien Gap? Because that's where the road ends. I wanted to go to the end of the road. Well, I never made it to the end of the road. Plans change. The times were different as well, and sometimes motorcycles will break down. But I've always had that inclination to go as far as I could go towards the end. And of course, later that led to my work in Papua New Guinea. In the midst of that, music was a central part of my life and still is. Last summer when I was in Ontario, and then later at the UIA conference in Copenhagen, I had the opportunity to visit two places. This one here, the older brick building, is the first place I ever played professionally. I think I may have gotten about $5 for that. And this in Copenhagen is the last place I played professionally. So I got to see both of them in that one summer. Then English and philosophy at the University of Western Ontario. This too was an exploration largely of following the thoughts of other people over the last 2,000 years. What do they know, and what can I learn from what they know? I found that a very valuable experience and still do. And a lot of that has to do with the notion of empathy. Then finally to UBC architecture. It's one thing to gather up knowledge, but what really needs to happen is you have to use that knowledge somehow. And that's where I thought architecture was a place to actually implement some of the things that I had already learned. And again, I still believe that's true, that architecture is really a philosophical endeavor. So, what did I get out of that period? That first, as architecture is a science, we need to know what actually is. So we observe. There's a scientific basis to a lot of the knowledge that we gather in architecture. But then, as architects, we're always asking, well, what could be? In essence, I think architecture is still a utopian endeavor. We are looking for things that have yet to be. And I find that fascinating because each of us has in our heads something. We look at what is and say, I can do that better. I can do it better. Let's try. And that to me is sort of the essence of design. That you look at what is and say, it could be better. I know how to do it in a better way. But then the third part to that is not just what could be, but what should be. And that's the arena of ethics. And that, in terms of philosophy, I found to be the most interesting arena of philosophical thought. What should we do? How do we get then from the dream to the reality? And is that something that we should be moving towards? So in architecture school, I learned a few lessons, but fewer than I thought I might. In fact, I've always been troubled by the curriculum of architecture schools, and this is something I'll be writing about later this spring. I was dissatisfied in part because the most of my fellow students were students of the fine arts, and so just about everybody around me wanted to design something, whereas I came out of the word instead of the picture. I was reading and writing and not drawing. I had to learn how to draw when I started architecture school because I had no idea at all. But as I went through all of these courses in architecture school, I was still very dissatisfied with what was going on. There was something more that I wanted, and I started to find this in a book. And that book was Freedom to Build by John Turner. Now, another paper that I'm going to be writing this spring has to do with John Turner and his impact on not just my direction in architecture, but I think on the future of architecture. And a lot of that comes from Freedom to Build. He wrote that book after his experience in the slums of Peru in the late 50s and early 60s. And out of that came an approach to architecture that I think went well beyond just the technical aspects of building. The phrase that is often used, and certainly was by Turner himself, is housing is a verb. And I was confused initially by that phrase. Well, what does he mean, housing is a verb? Housing is a process. And that process is critical to how architecture will actually happen, what the end product is. We focus in architecture typically on that product. We look at magazines and we're looking at an end product of a process. You know, is this a good building? Is it well designed and so on? I like it, I don't like it, but it's a product at the end of a process. And what he's saying is it's the process that's important here, because that will change what that product is. And that, at that time, changed the way I thought about architecture into the fact, as I see it, that architecture is a political act. What are we doing and how are we doing it and with whom? Where is the power structure in that process, and who makes decisions? And what Turner was saying is the decisions have to be made from the bottom up. They have to start in the community itself and not where the money is, so to speak. And typically, that's where it does start. It starts with money and it ends with a building. Where are the people in that process? And what Turner is talking about here is the people have to be in the center of that process. It must start with them. And I thought, okay, now that makes sense to me. Because this relates to ethics, as far as I was concerned. But there was still a long way for me to go to be able to get to where I found myself before I left SoA+D. part of that was I received a travel award from the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, and that brought me here back in, I think, 1987. First to the AIT, and then to KMITL. Why did I wind up there? Because they won one of the UIA architecture awards for students. And I thought, how did that happen? What did they do? I want to talk to those people that did it. And I did. What they were doing was community architecture. So as part of that travel, I went to China and learned a bit about what was called then barefoot architecture. This is after Mao's concept of barefoot medicine, where you bring the well-trained but non-architects into the rural areas in order to provide services to local communities that otherwise would never have access to it. Where do architects work mostly? In the city. If you're not in the city, chances are you're not going to have that kind of access. And so what this group did is get people out into the rural areas in order to do some of the planning that was absolutely necessary in these areas, and they would otherwise have had no access to that planning expertise at all. Similarly, I spent some time in Indonesia with an architect friend of mine, Robbie Solarto, and they were doing a lot of work back in the 70s after the earthquake in the north of Bali. And in that work, one of the points he made is look, when he took his students down there, he said, your job when you're down there is to listen. Don't think you can build things like local people can build things. You're not there to instruct them. You're there to listen to what they say and to see what they're doing. And I thought at the time, this is an important lesson to learn, because architects will always present themselves as experts. I mean, we're professionals. If you're a professional, you're supposed to have the answers. And I know that when I have gone into communities with my students, more often than not, that is exactly what happens. Even in the community, they say, well, you draw it, you're the expert, you tell us what to do. And this is not the way it is meant to work. If you're going to do this, as John Turner was suggesting, if it's a process, that process has to start with the community, not with your expertise. You have to listen to what they're saying first. So out of that, one of the things I learned in that process was that we have to understand where our knowledge fits into the community. And we really have to overcome professional arrogance. And that is a problem with all professions. You go to your doctor and the same thing will happen. That they have the answer and you don't. But if they're listening to you, are those answers going to change? And if they aren't listening to you, what is the answer going to be? Maybe another set of pills or something like that. In other words, okay, we understand. Here, take this and go away. That kind of arrogance cannot work if you're committed to the community. It has to start with them, which means your most important job is to listen to what they're saying. I went from, while I was actually running my own business in Vancouver, I was also acting as a community organizer for the Downtown Granville Tenants Association. Part of the reason I wanted to do that is because if you're going to do architecture in the community, you better understand the community. Here we are. Here's a community that's facing mass eviction. And in the course of that eviction, you have to be thinking about, well, okay, if the state, in this case the city, is saying you have to get out of here because we have more important things to do with the land that you're on, where do these people go? What's going to happen next to these people? And is it appropriate? Does anybody ask? Well, I wanted to go into the community directly and start asking those questions to the architects and the planners of the city. And in doing that, I started to learn there's a line between community organizing and architecture. And when I came to start teaching here, I had to be very aware of what that line was. I'm here to teach architecture, not community organizing. On the other hand, architecture by itself, without the community organizing, is going to be difficult to accomplish at all. From there, I went to Papua New Guinea. Part of the reason I wanted to do that, number one, I wanted to get to the edge, and believe me, that's an edge in Papua New Guinea. There was so much there that I learned, and a big part of that was about my own assumptions. We assume so much about what's around us. We don't think about it at all. When I went to Papua New Guinea, I realized that those assumptions are not safe assumptions to make if you're an architect. In one instance, we went out to a community in the southwest of Papua New Guinea, and Chevron was there looking for gas and oil, as Chevron will. And one of the things that they were doing there is they were working with the community because they had to. If they didn't work with the community would get up in arms and say, hey, you said you were going to give us a school. You said you were going to give us a health clinic. Where is it? And of course, in many instances, the corporation would say, yeah, we'll get to that. And then they don't. So what Chevron did in this case is they got a hold of the Department of Works, which is where I worked, and said, look, you need to help us with that community side of things. I mean, you represent the government here, so we'll pay for it, but you help us organize it, okay? So one of our employees went out there and learned that already Chevron had come into the community and brought in 200, I think it was, Singer sewing machines. These were the treadle sewing machines, so it didn't require electricity. The trouble was, these Singer sewing machines meant that you already had cloth. There was no history of cloth in that area. In that particular place, nobody'd done, there was no history of weaving. There was no history of any of that. They were still using leaves and so on as clothing. So what are they going to do with Singer sewing machines? Now, Chevron assumed that okay, everybody's got cloth, and if we start, like a sewing club, and then they could sell this material and so on, that by golly, we'll have community economic development. And yet, when they brought the sewing machines in, nobody knew what to do with them because they'd never seen cloth before. in some parts of this country, they were living pretty much in the Stone Age. And we just assume all of these things around us. And a lot of it is plastic. But once I got there, I realized you can't make those kinds of assumptions. You have to start from scratch. And in order to understand what's going on, you better ask the community, because they already know what's going on. Another part to that was the relationship to development and colonialism. Now, Papua New Guinea was initially under the colonial power of the UK. That this was at the turn of the 1900s, prior to the First World War, and Germany had a colony there as well. After the First World War and reparations, the UK got the responsibility, let's say, of taking care of that colony entirely. It was part of the reparations. In that, they realized, look, we don't really want anything to do with this. Let's give it to the Australians. And they did. So the Australians ran that country until 1975. After 1975 and independence, it was the Australians and the Japanese that had basically economic control of the country. So there was Japanese aid and Australian aid that was supporting almost everything. Education, healthcare, the two most important areas of aid, as well as virtually everything else that was going on. If you didn't get money from the Australians, you got it from the Japanese. And that was pretty much it for running the country. On top of that, there was income from resource extraction. But in essence, this was a big aid project. Well, what is the aid like? How does this aid work? And I was engaged in a lot of that for the 3 years that I was there, and learned an enormous amount about what aid can do and what it utterly fails to do. And in the end, what did that come back to? It came back to the community itself. How are we spending money here? Well, if that gets decided in Canberra, or it gets decided in Tokyo, where's the community in that? What do they actually need? Well, in this instance, that need is only expressed through things like the World Bank and JICA and AusAid. Well, at the end of that, after I read my ad in the newspaper, I wound up here in 1998. Now, prior to that, I was, while I was still in Papua New Guinea, I was acting as a technical aid representative to the ambassador from Papua New Guinea to the Habitat 2 conference in Istanbul. As a part of the preparations for that conference, I was involved with a lot of what the UN calls PrepComs, preparatory committee meetings that were used to draft the Istanbul Declaration ultimately. In other words, that's the document that is signed by all the countries that attend. So because I was familiar with that document and how it developed, when I got here that first year, there was another UIA competition, student competition. And that competition was implement the habitat agenda in your city. I thought, wow, that's a broad program. What are we going to do here? but I really wanted to do it because one, I'd been involved with the drafting of that report, but secondly, it seemed to me that this was a great way first to introduce to students what that report meant and what it means to architecture, and then how you actually do something about it, how you act as an architect, how you use your knowledge in that process. So I'm taking what John Turner was talking about and adding this UN document and saying, okay, now what can we do? And that was my first year here. So we entered this competition. This was a studio in 1998. The competition or the Congress, the UIA Congress, was in Beijing in 1999. So that first semester I was here, we had to get our submissions in. And we went through the habitat agenda and the number of issues that arose out of that, and then entered into this process of identifying communities that met the standards that were required, collecting data, doing preliminary design, presenting it to the community, getting their feedback, and making revisions, doing another presentation, and then a set of drawings. I think you had two sheets maximum. Anyway, we went through this process, and subsequently every year I would do a similar studio in different communities in and around Bangkok. And this particular one I quite enjoyed because it was actually right on the street. And it struck me that this kind of street architecture or community architecture was really, for me, vital. And that's the community. One of the next things that wound up happening was construction camp housing, and that was in, I think, 2001. I came back to this later. But I learned from an engineer friend of mine that in the building of the new airport, they were planning a construction camp for 20,000 people. And I thought, my God, that's a city. That's a city. How can you do that? And frankly, can you show me a picture of what you have designed for 20,000 people? Well, he said, well, why don't you just come out and have a look? And what they were doing was site prep at that point. So they were preloading the land and so on. No buildings were there except, well, this is a plan of their little city. He told me, well, you know, we have a 7-Eleven there, and if you probably, because there is a 7-Eleven, or was here, wasn't there? Yeah. Well, when the first year this was open, there was no 7-Eleven, and there were a lot of students saying, how can this possibly be? What are we doing out there? There's no 7-Eleven. So he says, yes, we have a 7-Eleven. And I said, well, what about a school? Is there a school? He said, why would we have a school? You know, these are workers. They're not children. And I said, but children are on that site right now. This was the site back then. And here was one of the existing camps for the workers that were doing the site prep. And I don't know if you know the Human Development Foundation, the Mercy Center. Father Joe, he, along with the Lighthouse Club, built a school there on their own. And there were, I think, about 70 children in that school at that time. Um, well, I thought, I bet my students could do a better job than this. Let's start this as a studio project, and I took them through another process. Let's go out to some existing camps and see what is there now, um, and then what we could do about that. This was a school that, again, Father Joe was responsible for, and it was just a couple of marquee type structures, um, and he put up some corrugated tin on the outside by the road, just basically for sound. Um, One of the things that came out of this process of considering what to do with not just the site itself and the people living there, but in particular with children living there, I thought there should be a way that we can maximize the use of funds and then maximize the circulation of those funds within the community. In other words, what you want to do is get the community directly involved in whatever the construction will be in that process of construction, and you pay them so that money circulates within the community first. And then you maximize, of course, user involvement, because if they're going to be working on the site, they need to know what's going on there. So you have to involve them. And then you maximize local resources. Where are the materials coming from, and so on. And then finally, especially for the children, you maximize the learning opportunities within it. Now, I was learning a lot, but what I really wanted to be able to see is how we could turn this into opportunities for the children to learn about their own built environment. This raised, in my mind, a connection with human rights, and in this case, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I took that idea of the relationship between rights and working with kids to the girls' home. Father Joe at the Mercy Center had two homes, the boys' home and the girls' home. And these, in essence, were orphans, or their parents were having problems either in jail or with drugs or something, and they had to get out of that environment. So there were about 40 kids in the girls' home, ranging in age, as you can sort of see here, from about 6 to about 14. And I started in that project teaching English. Now, I have to confess, I don't know anything about teaching English. I did a degree in English, but that was in English literature. If they wanted to know about Shelley and Keats, I could say something about that. But grammar, no. So what I wound up doing is I started to teach them architecture. This beam, column, and so on. And I thought, really, this is not good. But what else? I didn't know any other way to do it. So I started teaching them architecture. In the process of that, I got 3 of my students in the summertime to come with me and then teach more specifically some elements of architecture to these kids, of course, in Thai. So these 3 students came out, and we went through this process. Now, I know those 3 students learned a lot about architecture over that period because they had to teach it. And I was learning a lot from my 3 students, as well as observing what was going on with the children and their responses to what they were getting from the students. And again, I went back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As it happened, when I was doing that teaching. It was the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Universal Declaration, 1998. And we took the students, the children, through a design process, and eventually we drew up a plan for what could be changed in that existing set of shop houses, and presented that to the kids. And some of them were very enthusiastic about it and loved the model. And I can understand why, that kids love models. And these are some of the drawings that the kids did. And these are some of the drawings that my students did. Later, this is in 2001 now, I had the pivotal experience of going to Pammahakan. And I learned more there than I learned anywhere else. Not just here at SoA+D, but from the community itself. So this particular community workshop was like the others in many ways, except for the fact that they were facing a constant pressure for eviction. And part of that pressure had to do with the Ratanakosin master plan. What we did is we went through with the community and identified what was there, what could be changed, what needed to be taken down and replaced. And then we learned a number of things about how it is that these pressure points and conflicts exist, and then how they might be resolved. And here's just a short list of some of those issues that arose out of that, and I've written about that a number of times since. So we had a process, we set up design parameters, and then dealt with some of the implications of those design parameters. And again, the habitat agenda was part of that. We had a number of workshops, and developed these program requirements. Design parameters were looking at the history of the community, and it did have a significant history. And then we went through some of that cultural history as it was explained by the community, and then started to develop a plan that had a relationship to the plan that BMA had already proposed as part of the Ratanakosin master plan. And a lot of that came down to a park. Now, has anybody been to that, to Pammahakan after it turned into a park? Has anybody been there? Has anybody been there before, when it was still a community? Well, I have to say, I could not bring myself, I have not yet gone to Pammahakan after the park was there. I just can't do it. It's just, I don't want to see how they have destroyed this community. Anyway, we went through this process and came up with a plan that included parks. And basically, the concept was in part based on Jane Jacobs and her concepts of parks, and also pocket parks that you see in cities throughout the U.S. Certainly in New York City, there's lots of pocket parks. And I thought, well, there's precedent for this. We could do that here. There's lots of precedent for this. And so we developed this design. A lot of what they wanted to do was to allow for commercial activity, because at that point, tourists were coming through there from the Klong boat into Ratanakosin and back again, and they wanted to capture some of that tourist trade. You know, how do we become part of getting these tourist dollars? We would like to do that too. Can we have a commercial front? Well, of course you can, but where does that idea come from? It has to come from the community itself. That's what they wanted. And so we went through this design process and looked at some of the conflicts that arose out of it. And a lot of that had to do with culture and history. And in one of the papers I wrote about that cultural history is invisible for most people because they're poor. UNESCO protects a cultural history, but what kind of cultural history does it protect? It protects official cultural history. And what we knew was there, because the community told us it was there, was their own history for the last 150 years. They knew things about this particular plot of land that nobody else knew anymore. They could tell BMA things they didn't know because they had knowledge, special knowledge, you might say, that only existed in that community. But you had to ask. BMA wanted a park. Well, the community wanted a park too. Out of that, I started to think about the connections between these different sectors of the design and development process. The profession itself, where government fits into that, where schools fit into that, and where NGOs fit in, and how they all have something that they can contribute to the community. But again, where's the community in this? It has to be in the center. Out of this process, we developed a feasibility study. Now, what happened is as we were doing the, I would say, a final presentation to the community to show them, you know, here's the data we've collected. Here's what you told us you wanted in the program. Here's what we did. What do you think? The day before we were doing that presentation, which was to be on a Saturday, the day before, BMA came in and nailed eviction notices on everybody's door. So when we arrived on Saturday morning, there were some very unhappy people in that community. And there had to be a way, I thought, that we can recover from this sort of disaster. They had 45 days to get out. And here we come to say, here's what you could do in the community. Yeah, we could if we weren't evicted. So when I got back to the school, I thought, oh, you know, how can I salvage this studio? What can we do with the information we've got? And I said, okay, the next step is we have to do this feasibility study. And the students got together. It was about a 90-page document, bilingual document, because we wanted to be sure that it wasn't just BMA officials that would get this document, that it would be an international document as well. So it was going to be in English and available to other organizations like the UN. So we put together this feasibility study and handed it over to the community. What they did with it next is they went straight to the BMA planning department and said, we have an alternative plan. You can guess what BMA might have said. They said, we don't care about your plan. We're the planners. You're not. Go away. Go away. Well, they might have gone away, but this community was, I think, special, and the leadership in that community was special. They didn't go away. What wound up happening is we got together with NGOs, with other schools, and most importantly, I would say Harvard, because that Harvard name and a Harvard card goes an awfully long way in opening doors everywhere. So we got together with schools and NGOs and approached the government to say, look, this is not a bad plan. And ultimately, one of the NGOs, the Center for Housing Rights and Evictions, helped the community to make a submission to the National Human Rights Commission. Now, at that point, the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand was still quite a new commission. And so in fact, I think that was quite lucky on our part, because it meant that we got a hearing. But in addition to that, what we submitted to the National Human Rights Commission was a document that said this is an infringement of housing rights, it's an infringement of cultural rights, and so on, and explained the process and all of that. The picture at the bottom is of one of our students making a presentation to the chair of the Human Rights Commission. And you can see in front of her all of these people in suits. And nobody was looking at this back row, which was composed of 4 students, me, and the 4 community leaders. No one was really interested, except for the commissioner, in what they had to say. She made a 5-minute presentation on what we did in the community, the process, the importance of that process, and the design that came out of that process. Now, there was no PowerPoint or anything like that. She just had to describe it. But it was, of course, as a result of that, mainly about the process. At the end of that, after 2 hours of listening to the National Housing Commission and the governor's office and the planning department and so on, at the end of that, the commissioner said, I don't see anything wrong with this plan, and I don't know why you do. I want you to cease and desist until such time as I've had the opportunity to review this plan and come to some conclusions about it. And at that moment, I thought, whoa, there's a relationship here between their human rights and design. There's a relationship. I want to know more about that relationship. And that's what I've been studying ever since that moment. This was just pivotal to me, because it just opened my eyes to that connection between architecture and human rights. There are things that we can do and tools that we have that lawyers don't have. When we think about human rights, we're always thinking about the law. And it isn't just about the law. We have tools as well. And I think there are ways that we can use those tools. And that's what I've been sort of unpacking and investigating for the last 20 some odd years. One of those things is participation, the right of expression. And that has a lot to do with democracy. The right to access information, it has to do with citizenship, and it has to do with organization. And in organization, what I'm talking about here is moving away from things like master plans, which are definitely top-down, into more networks. Instead of pyramids, you have networks. And we live on networks now. I think we could take some advantage of that. I'll quickly go through this tsunami recovery that I spent about 2 years, some of that with students and some of that with the UN, in that recovery process. And a big part of that was in Ban Nam Phem. A lot of that had to do with this how architecture is used in the service of power, um, and how the pressures of development uh, can change the dynamics of any development. An example of that, then, I took this picture when it was being presented at a meeting of officials in somewhere in Kaulak, and I knew that this particular drawing would be taken down and disappear. So I wanted to have a picture of it before it disappeared. What this is for Ben Kem, which before the tsunami was a small community of about 5,000 people focused on fishing. And after the tsunami, there were about 1,800 people left. And they had to rebuild practically everything. One of the suggestions came from an architectural firm in Bangkok, I'm sure, by way of some developer, that this could be a cruise ship terminal. This small community of fisherfolk. And so they had plans for, you can see the cruise ship there, and then the fishing boats closer to the dock. In the end, this didn't happen because there were too many sandbars. Not because the community didn't want it. They never talked to the community. It was just the physical problems of establishing a cruise ship terminal in a place that had too many sandbars. That's all it was. But this was provided to the officials at the time as a viable alternative for the tsunami recovery, a cruise ship terminal. And I thought, my God, this can't work, but why aren't they talking to the community about this? They've already got, because we were talking to the community. One of the things that at one point, because the Army was in there building a lot of housing at that time, and it really, I thought, well, good, something at least is getting built. But when I talked to one of the community leaders in Ban Nam Kem, he was saying, can't you do something about the Army? And I thought, what can I do about the Army? I'm not even Thai, for heaven's sakes, much less an official high up in the government. I can't do anything. But he said, look, what they're doing here is they're building an instant slum. Because they were building the housing with the wrong materials in the wrong place. Well, what's the Army going to do? They're going to do what they're going to do. You build stuff quick and you get over it, right? You just keep moving. And I don't know what's there now. I haven't been down since then. This was the last time I was down there was 2008. But I would be surprised if it was as viable as the Army thought it might be. So a lot of what came out of that was how we access information and skills and resources and apply them within the community at their discretion. But a big issue for me was how we understand land. And I wrote a paper about the land issue in the post-tsunami environment as well. And I have been thinking about that land issue ever since then, because we have the land issue in British Columbia right now too. A lot of the land in British Columbia is unceded territory that is I can't even, I don't know if there's even a name for it. It isn't property. It's land that is under the stewardship, let's say, of indigenous people. What we used to call Indians in Canada and the U.S. These people have been living on that land for thousands of years, colonial people came in and said, oh, well, this is all ours now. That was happening all along the Andaman coast, where lawyers were coming down from Bangkok waving pieces of paper saying, this land is ours. Look, I have a piece of paper. And the response I kept hearing from local people was, how can that be? It's just a piece of paper. You know, we know this land. You know, my grandfather planted that tree, and so on and so on. They knew the land. They understood the land they were on. It's not a commodity. It's something else. And I've been thinking about that ever since. It was a great, for me, learning exercise, because I've taken that to heart ever since then in anything I do in British Columbia now. Then I went back to migrant construction workers, and I won't dwell on that, but this was a profound experience for me too, with migrant children on construction sites. It just continues to drive me crazy as an idea. A lot of these photographs here were taken by Chris. You know, these construction sites are dangerous. For adults, they're dangerous, much less children. And you know, that's their playground. So we wound up building a school, a bamboo school. In part, I wanted to do this out of bamboo because I wanted to understand more about bamboo. I learned a lot about bamboo, but I didn't learn it at the right time. I learned it after we built the school and not before. But the school was there and run by the Mercy Center for about 10 or 12 years. It was finally taken down by the owner of the land, a farmer in the area who subsequently, I think last year or the year before, built a set of apartment buildings on that land. So it's gone now. So this brings me to my final point. What I have learned so far, and that is that relationship between architecture and human rights. And again, that point of Pamahakan was pivotal for understanding that. Before that, I was getting hints about that relationship, but not putting the threads together. And it was with Pamahakan that I finally, geez, there's a lot to unpack here, a lot to discover. And so so far, what I have come up with is there are 6 different areas where architecture and human rights come together. The first is in participation. That's a key. And this is something that came up in the first UN Habitat Conference in 1976. Participation, it said in the Vancouver Declaration, participation is a right. Well, at the time, because as luck would have it, I was an architecture student in Vancouver when the Habitat Conference came around. And I learned more, I think, in that 2-week period at the Habitat Forum than I learned in school, because it's what I wanted out of architecture. I wanted that sort of global vision of what architecture could do, but for whom? You know, I had no interest in architecture for the rich. They've always got options, but the people who don't have options may need a lot more help and support to fight against all of that power structure. So I started to learn that at the Habitat Forum in 1976 as a student, but it didn't sort of pull together until 2002 at Pamahakan. So the first one, participation is a right. The second is about cultural rights. And here what I'm talking about is the rights of vulnerable communities to their own history. The second or third is rights of access, and here this is my wedge into architecture, in terms of trying to get architects, practicing architects, to understand that connection. The rights of access is something that I can begin to talk about in terms of the building code and disability legislation, which has grown around the world. We have the sensitive tiles in our sidewalk paving and so on. Well, this is a global thing now. But what is behind the building code? What's behind the building code is that people have rights. In this case, people with disabilities have the same rights that you and I do without disabilities. How is it that our design either supports that right or obstructs it? And as often as not, I see obstructions everywhere. And that leads us to things like universal design. Can we do that? How much would it cost? We need to be thinking about this all the time. But when I talk about rights of access, I'm not just talking about disabilities. I'm talking about the right to the city as well. The right to the services of the city. The right to water, for example. Garbage collection and so on. If you're living in a slum, why does a slum look like a slum? Probably they're not getting services. And why aren't they getting services? Because the city will not allow them to have those services, because if they get them, then what the city is in effect saying is that we accept your existence. And they don't want to do that. And that's true all over the world. The fourth is about forced evictions and the right to housing. I think that's a fairly obvious one, but a lot of that has to do with what's called, the World Bank refers to as development-induced displacement. What is development-induced displacement? Well, for the World Bank, a lot of that comes down to things like dams. How many people were evicted, in essence, as a result of the Three Gorges Dam? Over 1 million people were evicted. Where did they go? Well, it wasn't the engineer's problem to even address that issue. But it's more than just dams and highways and so on. It's also gentrification. How urban land economics functions in relationship to gentrification and in relationship to evictions. That's one of the things I was dealing with as a community organizer in the Downtown Granville Tenants Association. The fifth thing is environmental rights. And here it's not just our rights to a clean environment, which of course is important, but it's the rights of the environment itself, the rights of, say, a river to exist. And that is getting more and more accepted in jurisprudence now than it ever was, and that will grow. And then finally, workers' rights, and a lot of that came out of what I was looking at in terms of workers and their families in construction camps in and around Bangkok. So I've been going in large part from anarchist theory. Now, where did that come from? It came largely from John Turner. From mutual aid within a community through to field work. Okay, let's take this idea and see how it works in the field. You really have to do that in architecture. All of our designs need to be reviewed in some way by, well, did it work? I've been thinking about this for some time. Did it actually work? Let's go back and look. This happens all the time in architecture, but in this instance, what I'm looking at more is a theory of process. And then finally, you take that field work and how theory has worked in the field, and then you go back and say, well, there are some parts of it that didn't work. Let's look at that and see how we can make it work better. And then you just keep going through that cycle again and again. So here I am in the last 10% of my time on this planet, and I'm thinking to myself, what next? I don't have a lot of time here, but I need to use it with some wisdom. Now, a lot of that is looking back. And I think while that's important, because that's the way that you can take that field work and apply it to an evolving theory, which I think is a constant that has to go on. But the other part of it is prognosticating. You know, well, where does it go from here? And that's what this paper that I'm presenting at the UIA in November will be about. Where do we take John Turner's ideas in this case? Where do we take that? What can we do in architecture that applies his ideas more effectively even than he did? So a lot of what I'm doing then is writing, which is what you would expect from somebody in that contemplative stage of life. But on the other hand, at the bottom here, the fourth item, I would really love to build more schools. I think I got such a kick out of that, working with students and working with the local community, the farmers in that particular community in Subut Bacan, and watching the kids in that school. That's just a delight. And I think you'll find as you start practicing architecture, you're going to get a lot of that same kind of joy when you step back and say, hey, it worked. It worked. So there's a lot left to do, and I'm obviously running out of time to do it, but I want that list to be longer than my life, that there's always something left to be done. Thank you.
It's okay. It's okay. Thank you, Anton and Graham, for your lecture. We will start the Q&A session now from the floor. Is there any question you would like to ask? We will provide you a microphone so you can talk to Anton and Graham.
Hello. Thank you so much for your talk. So I'm doing my thesis on vocational school in a refugee camp. So along Thai Myanmar borders in one of the camps. So my thesis aim was to provide an architecture that provides vocational training for them to live a self-sustained life, and at the same time providing an architectural prototype for the community. But right now, what I'm struggling right now is I went to the camp for a day and I talked to them, but it was like a one-way ticket and I no longer have contact with them. So my struggle is I think my approach becomes like a top-down. And so I started to design like extravagant design with the complete ignorance of their resources and capacity. So my question is, how do I find a common ground between, like you have mentioned, my professional ignorance to the needs of those people? So in a nutshell, how can I help them from a distance?
Yeah, that's a very common problem in architecture, because a lot of what we do, regardless of who the client group might be, a lot of what we do is at a great deal of distance. We may spend some time on the site, but we rarely talk to the community itself, and I found that same difficulty But in 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 the construction camps, well, one of the things I did early on is I said to the students, look, before you start anything, I want you to go to the UN High Commission for Refugees. They have an office in ESCAP. Go to the UN High Commission and get from them the standards for housing for refugees, and compare those standards, the UN standards, to the standards that you see in the construction camps themselves. And it becomes immediately obvious that these standards are not being met, certainly in the construction camps at all. So it was a way for me to make a connection. But again, really, what is the UN? It's the top of the top down. But they do. You can get something out of what material they have already gathered. And while I agree completely that you have a great deal of difficulty in, particularly as a student, in getting into those communities for any length of time to be able to listen to what they have to say. But I think you can at least gather a fair bit of information from not just the UN, but other more anecdotal sources. When I was looking at this, one of the things that I came across, and this is going back, I think, late 90s, early 2000s, somewhere in there, when all of the refugee camps on the Cambodian border were repatriated. So the UN said, we don't need these camps anymore. And people were sent back home. But the people in those refugee camps had been there for at least a generation, 20 years plus. And the thought I was getting onto is, what happens? And here, that's where vocational schools can come in. What happens when they go back? They have a country to rebuild. I mean, the reason they left is not just economic. It's often, war, persecution, et cetera, et cetera. When they go back to rebuild a country, do they have any of the skills with which to rebuild it? And I learned a lot from reading a lot of anecdotal material on those Cambodian camps that were there in the 70s through the 90s. I think that there are other ways that you can sort of make adjustments for that kind of that need for information, and some of it would have to do with, well, what happened before? Let's look into the history of this. What happened before in refugee camps all over the world, and there's so many reports that are available on that come from camp dwellers themselves, as well as the UN and other agencies like the NGOs. You're probably going to get quite different information from the NGOs than you would the UN. So CARE and Oxfam and a lot of other organizations like that, I think would be an important first step if you can't get back to the community itself. And the other side, the community keeps changing anyway. And that was true in construction camps. That when the job is finished, the camp disperses. Now, in some instances, like the camp that I was working with in Samut Prakan, the camp didn't move. They just moved jobs in the area. So they were working on different move-ons and things like that. But it was all in Samut Prakan. So it was just a matter of traveling, which meant that camp was, in a way, semi-permanent. Some refugee camps are like that too, and certainly the ones on the Cambodian border back then were semi-permanent. And there was a lot of interesting architecture that came out of that too, by the camp dwellers themselves. What were they building? How did they do it? And why? So I think there are things you can do to compensate, but I agree, it's difficult.
The student needs to prepare the question first. So then I have a question to your time here at the School of Architecture and Design, and how did you work with the students? Because that, I can imagine that was something very, very different. The students didn't expect that to happen, that they have to go to communities and they would expect to just do a traditional design task and come up with drawings of a building. But obviously your approach was very, very different. So how did you make them follow you? And then how was your experience that you had with them?
Well, there was always grumbling, and that was I just accepted that there would be grumbling. But what I tried to do is explain that, look, just because I choose this client group for my own reasons doesn't mean that what I'm telling you here, what we're going through here, it's the same process. If it's a group of doctors that wants a clinic, you've got to listen to them too. So whoever the client is, start by listening to what it is that they actually want, not what you think they want or what you want. Listen to what they have to say and build a program out of that. And that was really, for me, what a big part of that is when I was going through architecture school, and most of the time, any architecture school I have been to, a program is given. Okay, we're going to do a mixed-use building and, X number of stories high, and it's going to be in this location, so on, so on, so on. Look at the zoning, look at the envelope, etc. And what I was interested in, because it's about a process, is you got to figure out the program here too. Make up the program. This is a big part of what you have to do as an architect. Figure out what the program is, and you're going to get that from your client. Now, what you do with that program, there's a lot of leeway there in terms of what you can design, but you have to have a program to start with. Okay, here's how you can do that. Here's the community. Here's the client group. Start with them. Now, at the same time, the other thing, and here's where I had the most grumbling, because where's the design? All you're talking about is a process here. Where's the design? I want to design something. And this isn't like a museum or something. I can't be Frank Gehry doing this. So when we're talking about some of the fundamental problems in any slum community, well, you've got infrastructure problems. You have potential problems with fire. Lots of dead ends and things like that. And you think, oh, geez, if I was trapped in this particular house at the end of this little alleyway, how could I get out? And in a lot of instances, it just scares the hell out of you. And then you have to tell them, look, there are things that you see that they can't see because they live in it every day. They just assume it. But you can see it because you're the architect. And you start to talk about, oh, that's a problem. And a lot of that is about infrastructure. Where does the electricity come from? Follow the wire. Where does the water come from? And it goes back to somebody else's meter who's charging extra, and so on and so on. And then you start to get into those broader issues of community development. One of the things that we worked in a community behind the RCA entertainment area. There was a community behind there, and most of the people that lived in that community worked in RCA, as waitresses and so on. But they had to get water trucked in because there was no city water, and they had no other access. No one would sort of send a pipe in their direction for metered water so they could make a little profit out of that. They just didn't have it. And so they had to get it brought in by truck and put into cisterns. You look at those cisterns and they're not very good. And that's your drinking water. It's water for everything. And they paid more for their water than I was paying as a foreigner. That shouldn't be right, but it was. And so infrastructure becomes not just an architectural issue, engineering issue, it's a community development issue as well. And there's where that line occurs. You have to say something about it, but then you can't enter into that territory too much, because then you're not teaching architecture, you're teaching community development. And particularly, I would say, community economic development. But I wanted them to be able to see the connection between all of those things, so that when they do go out and start to design whatever, it's in their heads already, that it's not just about that pretty picture in a magazine. It's not just about the product. It's a whole range of issues that impinge upon what that product will turn into eventually. And if you're not thinking about that process and about all of those impinging issues, well, what are you really designing? It's not, it's in the air.
I have questions like, in case some of our students would be interested in to become a community architect, could you please give the scenario-based career path? How could they make it for living, as an example? Yeah.
Well, I can't give a lot of advice on that, because I'm barely scratching the surface of my financial capabilities. I think I said that the wrong way, but there are ways to do that. I know in certainly in the U.S. There's a whole association of community design. A lot of those members, member organizations, are affiliated with the university. Some are independent of the university, but like the Pratt Institute has had a community design center for at least 50 years. And students are going through that all the time. And there's a core group of professors and professionals that are permanent employees of that community design center. There are similar organizations, certainly in the UK. I think Oxford Brookes University has a great program for that, to sort of enter that stream of architecture. If I was starting out again, that's where I'd go first, is Oxford Brookes. But the other one, and we have an adjunct here who's involved in that, the Bartlett and the what was it called, Development Planning Unit at University College London. I think it's a fantastic area for planning and architecture. But ask John Gang. He's much more familiar than I am now. But I think there are those kinds of avenues that can open up that door. I would love to see that happen much more than it is. One of the things I tried to do here is establish a UNESCO chair in community architecture and human rights. We didn't quite get there, but I'm still very keen. That would be another thing on my short list. I'm still very keen on seeing if we can find a host university to establish that at the UN level, so that you have the kind of institutional support, global institutional support, that can start to pull these different threads together, like the Pratt Institute and other universities that are already doing this. And I think a lot of what's happening right now, when I talk to people that are teaching community architecture, they find themselves to be very isolated within their own architecture school, because they're doing work that is sort of outside the tradition, and as such, they get very little support from the university on that, and as a result, they tend to be marginalized and isolated. So when we all get together at some point, as we have done over the years, that's one of the common complaints is, I've got nobody to talk to about this except you guys, and it's only once a year. So within the school system, within the architecture curriculum, I think we need to expand that to allow for more opportunities and options in architecture. And that's the problem I had when I was in architecture school. What I was thinking at the time was, what am I doing with this stuff? Everybody around me is already an artist, and all I'm doing is talking about it. And what I was talking about is, this just doesn't seem right to me. Why? I don't want to work for rich people. There's something else going on here, and it's bigger. It's bigger. And that's when Habitat came to town and said, oh yeah, it's bigger, all right. It's the whole world, and it's all about housing and how the majority of the population of this planet can get any housing at all. And I thought, there. Now that sounds like a great challenge. And well, I've been following it ever since. But you do get isolated when you're doing that kind of work, I think. Sadly, I think there are ways out of it.
I have a question. Like, not long ago, I have been working on the project about the community around here, and when I went to their place and asked about the problem that they were having, I find that when we are the outsider, getting them to express their problem is quite difficult, and they tend to avoid our answer. And my question is, how do we get them to trust us enough to answer our question and share their problem?
Yeah, well, this is something that that I often talk about to architects, practicing architects, because we, the profession as a whole, to a large degree, represents the enemy. When the professional comes into any community with a suit and tie and says, we have some ideas. Well, what do you think the community is going to think? Oh, we don't need your ideas. Your ideas are only going to make things worse for us, and we'll probably be evicted. That's just the starting point. Now, from my own perspective, in the years that I was doing that, I found that bringing students into the community made it easier, not harder. And why it was easier is because students are less of a threat. What I would always say to the community itself, particularly to the leaders in that community, is this is now, you become the teachers. You're the teachers, not me. I'm going to sit back and observe, but you're going to teach my students now. And if you're willing to do that, I want to bring them in so you can teach them. But it's then you've sort of reversed the power dynamic, because as a student of architecture, you're coming in there as a prospective professional, and this is something I started to mention with the Robbie Solarto and working with students in the post earthquake in Bali in 1976. One of the things he said, and it just stuck with me for till now, is that he told the students, when you go to this community, your job is to listen. I don't want to hear you talking. I want you just to listen, because they're teaching you. They know more about how to build, as he called it, a 6-pole house than you ever will. So don't go in there with an arrogant attitude like, I'm the boss, because you're not. You're always a student in that case. I am too. I have no interest in telling a community what's good for them. I think it just nothing. I want nothing to do with that. And so for you as a student, you're in a better position because you're not as much of a threat as a professional architect actually would be. They are the enemy, and I know that because I worked as a community organizer. And who was I up against all the time when I was a community organizer? I was up against my own profession. Every day I was talking to architects and saying, why are you doing this? Every day. And so I knew every time they came into the community what everybody else was thinking, because I was thinking it too. You know, from the standpoint of the community, you're a problem. You're just another problem. And another big part of that is you come into a community, you better be prepared to give something back to that community. What's it going to be? You have to give something back because they paid with their time to teach you. What are you going to give back to them when you leave? Because, you know, this is another problem, that you're fixed in like a cycle of 3 months, basically, where something, a product has to come out at the end of a period, and you're going to get graded on that product. So you've only got this specified period of time, and it's very artificial, and it has to do with school semesters and things like that, that has nothing to do with the community. But your time is limited. But at the end of that time that you're spending in that community, you better have something to give back. Because really, we owe them. And I know with the Pamahakan community, I will always owe them. And honest to God, I don't know how I can give it back, but I'll do whatever I can.
So, from my question is that, do you think that social abuse can be solved with architecture due to the lack of public space and culture diversity presenting?
Sorry, I only heard part of that. Can you say it again? Sorry.
Okay. So, do you think that social abuse can be solved with architecture due to the lack of public space and culture diversity presenting?
Well, I think there's a whole number of questions really in there. One of them is what we mean by public space and what is actually happening to public space because it's disappearing. And that I think is a critical issue about what the nature of that space is, because it's being privatized all the time. And the more we fail to distinguish between actual public space and that private space that appears to be public, the more problems we're going to have with a whole range of issues to do with things like diversity and so on. So I remember years ago, one of my students was doing her thesis on spaces of democracy, and that's been rolling around in my mind ever since. What is that kind of space? And it's something that does keep coming up, especially as democracy is threatened globally now. What kind of spaces are there that support democracy? I was recently at a talk, a lunchtime talk at the Foreign Correspondents Club, and this professor was talking about basically current events in Hong Kong and the umbrella revolution and so on, the milk tea revolution, all of these things that are going on. Where was all of this happening? And then you compare what you see on television about public space, and in the case of Hong Kong, it really struck me just watching it on TV. This is happening on the streets. 1989, Tiananmen Square. It was happening in the square. A huge open space that's very available to tanks. What kind of a space is that? Is it a democratic kind of space? Briefly, it was, but and there's sadly lots of examples here, and that centered around Sanam Luang, and that kind of open space. What are those spaces of democracy, and how do we protect them? I don't know. I wish I did. I struggle with these ideas of space, and how we can protect that public sphere for those purposes of freedom of association and freedom of speech and so on. We're in a lot of trouble right now because we're not really protecting those kinds of spaces as perhaps we should, and there's always going to be a conflict between the state and the citizenry about how those spaces are used.
I have maybe the last question. Okay, thank you very much, Ajahn Graeme, for your coming to give a lecture to our SoA+D community. I'm quite impressed, and definitely our students learn a lot from you. Actually, the pick up today is we learn that we must have a good attitude to work with community, and then be a good listener and consolidate things together, what you do. But anyway, my question is, as we are designers, and we work from the bottom up, and then the hardest part is the implementation, how the ideas can be realized. Maybe you could suggest the lesson learned from Pam Mahakan or some others, how we could deliver the ideas into reality. From that, how do we convince authority or the stakeholders how this idea can how we can make that happen?
Hmm.
Your suggestion.
Well, um, Hummahakan was a success for a while, and then it failed. And it was that failure, I think, was certainly anticipated by the administrative state, that it was inevitable that this would happen. And yet, between the time that we were in that community, and there were others before us. I mean, Chula students were in there before us, and Silberkorn was in there too, and did a lot of work. But that when that community was faced with eviction in, I think it was 2000, the fall of 2001 or something like that. They lasted, another almost 20 years, which in a way is a success. I don't look at it as a success. They should still be there. And the fact that they're not is the failure as far as I'm concerned. But okay, let's just look at the success part of it. That we managed to slow that eviction down significantly for almost a generation. How did we do that? And I think that did work, because in this case, there were so many people involved internationally, so many people involved, like Harvard. Harvard made a big difference there. When Michael Hertzfeld was handing out his card to senior officials in BMA or the governor's office, the door opened because of Harvard. And he made a huge difference because of that, I think. In addition to his arguments, of course. And he has since written a book about that. But it was also the NGOs that, and again, that was global. The NGOs that were involved, and academics, not just Harvard and not just in Bangkok, Chula and KMUTT and so on, but internationally. So Michael gathered professors from anthropology departments around the world to say something about the status of that particular community. And it made a difference. Now, I would like to see that kind of thing repeated. But in addition to the difference that made, for me, the biggest difference was the community itself. They were organized already. And they knew how to deal with the media, for example. They could manipulate the media very well. So, for example, whenever there was a rumor going around that, the police are going to be coming in tomorrow morning early, what would they do? They would go across to the Wat, and then they would talk to the monks in the Wat and say, we need to have a ceremony tomorrow morning early. Well, yeah, okay. A ceremony would happen. And the police would come in and they'd say, there's a ceremony. We can't do anything right now. And lo and behold, every time it would work. But, that wasn't the only thing they did. But I saw that work and thought, these people are good. They know how to make this work. So it wasn't just the media. It was the officials. It was everything that they were always thinking and working and pushing, and had been already for years. So the community makes a huge difference, and therein lies, for me, in terms of architecture, part of the problem. I would love to see that what we're doing in architecture is supported by an anthropology department, by a physics department, by a chemistry department and so on. So, for example, one of the things that arose in Pamahakan was I can't remember who the governor was at that point, but he really didn't want the community to be there, and he said, "Oh, the community is responsible for polluting the Klong." And I thought, "Oh, wait a minute. I'd be willing to bet if you analyze the contents of that Klong that there's something else going on here, and it probably has to do with heavy metals and industry, and it doesn't have to do with the community." But I wish I had that data, and it could come from a chemistry department fairly quickly, but then it gets applied in another way. It gets applied politically. Look, hey, you're wrong. It's not the community that's polluting this Klong. It's something else. Here we have the data. So don't blow me off with fake stuff. We know because we've got the data. If we had that, I think it would have helped, but we didn't. And that's true in I would say every architecture school I've ever been to. That's always the case. That we're in a bubble. We're in an isolated silo of architecture, and what we're thinking about is hey, what's it going to look like? And all the rest of that, the process part of it, just gets shoved off to the side and saying, yeah, we'll get there. We'll talk to the right people and so on. No. As Turner would say, it's a verb, it's a process. It keeps happening, and if you're not doing something about that process, then that product at the end is going to be far different and meet far fewer of the needs of a community than it would otherwise. But it's hard. It's hard. But that's the challenge. That's what I love about it. It's hard, and you fail, and you fail, and you fail, and every now and then you have that little window of success. And in the case of Pamahakan, it lasted for almost 20 years. Jeez, okay. It isn't enough, but it was something. And then you take what you learn from that and say, how do we make that better the next time? Well, let's work on it.
All right. Thank you for your questions on the floor, and thank you for all of your answers as well. Now I'd like to invite Atan Kisanapon Watanawanyu, the chairperson of our architecture program, to give us his remarks. So can you both be here in front of the TV? Okay. In front of the TV. Both of you can go. Yes. So you can say it at the front of the TV as well.
Okay. How do we do it? Okay. Thank you again, Ajahn Graeme.
Wait.
Yeah. TV. Okay. They said we should be here.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Front and center.
Okay. So it's always very enjoyable. Always, and it's always a very good time for you and I, especially Ajahn Graeme. If you all know, he's also my former instructor, teacher, colleagues. I think he mentioned when he came, I think I was in fourth year. Fourth year, and doing some other crazy studio projects, and then in his elective class, it's like another world. So crazy with design studio like you guys. Now, like, just imagine I controlling your studio or crazy project. Okay, what is this Ajahn or this instructor, foreign instructor, introducing this community, which I think for me as well we overlooked, and in our profession we sometimes have very little or limited access or knowledge, right? Even for the Thai, not just foreign. When we go into the community, it's like, what are you doing here? Why are you doing here? It's all that kind of thing. Which, um, again, architecture, as Ajahn Graham uh, quite often, it's about people. It's about society. It's about everything. It's related, and I believe uh, that our school try to always encourage or promote this. What can we do as an architect? Okay, can we have a good intention, a good objective anyway, but I think we could find our place, our role to contribute back, in many ways. We don't have to really be very romantic. I mean, you know, should go out there and help the poor people or help the marginal or the vulnerable people. No, but even for the rich people, you can do. You can convince the rich to uh, do some good for the others. That's our role. If we can really crack that or do our best and with our suitable uh, alternative possibilities, and that's great enough. So I think, yeah, what I really learned and would like to share is, yeah, these are what our school, what all the Ajahn here and Ajahn Graham here try to support and promote. So I think this is the spirit we should be keep doing. Okay, so with all that, so please say thank you again to Ajahn Graham. Okay. Thank you, Graham.
Okay. Uh, okay. Maybe can we close the online platform first for one moment? Allow us to close the online platform for a moment here. Uh, okay. This is it for our talk series 2024 by SoA+D Architecture Program, supported by Media Lab and Sparking Lab. Thank you, Atan Graham, for this educational session, and thank you all of the students here and also the audiences online for taking interested in this lecture. See you again in the next talk series. Have a good afternoon.